The day my daughter brought her husband, her mother, and even the neighbors to her door, turning the porch into a fake trial with witnesses and twisted accusations, I knew this was far more than a family argument. But they forgot one thing. I had prepared for this day. Every bill, every statement, even the recording, all waiting to turn the tables. So what happened when the truth rang out right where they thought they had me cornered? When my daughter Claire slammed her ultimatum onto the kitchen table like a judge's gavel, the sharp crack echoed through the stillness of the room, rattling the light fixture above us. Even the spoons in the glass jar trembled faintly, as though the house itself had been jolted awake by her words. "You'd better start respecting my husband, or you'll end up on the street." The sentence hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. I felt the last fragile thread of obligation inside me snap, the way an over-tightened guitar string sings its final note and breaks, leaving only an aching silence behind. Decades of sacrifice, of quiet giving, of unspoken love, all of it collapsed into this single suffocating moment of ingratitude. And yet, instead of breaking, something in me steadied. I smiled. My lips trembled slightly, but my eyes lit up as though I had finally found the exit out of a maze I had been wandering for years. It was not the broken smile of a defeated father, but the quiet, knowing expression of a man who had just been handed the key to his own liberation. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady and hard as granite. My calloused hand rested on the table, fingertips brushing the cool wood, a silent reminder that this house had been built from my labor, my sweat, not from anyone else's. Claire blinked, perhaps expecting me to shout, to argue, to beg. Instead, I gave her composure, and that unnerved her more than anger ever could. 3 days later, the eviction notice was delivered to their apartment, and Derek's unemployment benefits finally ran dry. That was when my phone began to ring over and over, desperate, insistent. The screen lit up in the darkened room, flashing like a distress signal. I stared at it for a long moment, then calmly set it face down on the table. The ringing filled the silence, then shifted to the hollow beep of voicemail. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, steady calm in my chest. The coffee ring on my granite countertop gleamed like an accusation in the morning light, a small brown stain that carried the weight of something larger. The sun streamed in at an angle through the kitchen window, spotlighting the faint mark as though it were evidence in a trial. A blemish no bigger than a coin, yet enough to ignite the quiet war simmering beneath this roof. I had asked 3 times this week, politely. I believed that everyone used the coasters I had placed out. A small request, perfectly reasonable in one's own home. Yet the ring sat there, mocking me, a reminder of how easily courtesy had been dismissed. Derek shuffled into the kitchen around midday, moving with the sluggishness of someone who had just woken from a meaningless night. He still wore yesterday's crumpled t-shirt, faintly stained, and carrying the sour scent of sweat mingled with cheap snacks. His hair spiked in chaotic directions, the look of a man who had rolled straight out of an imaginary battlefield in one of his endless games. Without a word, he reached for my favorite mug, the one Claire had given me for Father's Day 5 years ago. I remembered her smile that morning, the way her eyes shone with pride when she handed it to me. A memory once warm and sacred, now soured as I watched it in Derek's careless hands. He poured himself coffee, eyes never leaving the glowing screen in his palm. Game sounds blared from the phone, a nonsense chorus of explosions and gunfire. He lifted the steaming mug and set it directly onto the granite countertop once again. The soft clink of ceramic against stone felt sharper than it should have, like the tap of fingernails against my chest. Steam rose, trickling into droplets that slid down and merged with the coffee ring already etched there, as though to deepen the stain. "Good morning," I said evenly, watching the ritual repeat itself. He muttered something unintelligible, perhaps a greeting, though his eyes never left the screen. "There are coasters right there," I reminded him, nodding toward the neat stack of ceramic discs arranged beside the coffee maker. They sat waiting like silent sentries, ready to protect the surface, but always ignored. My voice stayed calm, though I could feel the restraint in it. Derek finally lifted his head, his dull eyes sharpened, catching the light in a cold, cutting way, as if my words had insulted him more than they should have. His expression shifted slowly, from bored indifference to a sneer of disdain. The corner of his mouth curled into a half-smile, not amused, but challenging. "You trying to micromanage my coffee schedule now?" he asked. The word micromanage didn't fit. It felt alien in this kitchen, too clinical to mask the contempt he was lacing into it. I had built this kitchen with my own hands, every tile, every coat of paint, every cabinet I chose and installed myself. Every upgrade had been paid for with overtime wages, with long nights of labor that stole hours of sleep, but gave me the satisfaction of knowing I had crafted something lasting. Asking someone to use a coaster was not micromanagement. It was basic respect. "All I'm asking is that you protect the countertop," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Nothing about that is unreasonable." "You know what is unreasonable?" Derek pushed himself up from his slouch, standing tall, his shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed with a confrontational glint. The movement had the feel of a fighter stepping into the ring, ready to unleash an argument he had rehearsed in his head countless times. "Living in a house where you can't even relax," he fired back. "Always being watched, always being criticized, always having someone point out every little thing you do wrong." The words spilled from him like an indictment, but the irony stung. Because the man he described was not me, it was him. The one who sprawled across my couch 12 hours a day. The one who ate my food, left half-empty containers on the counter, and burned through utilities as if the bills never landed in my mailbox. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached, fighting to keep my voice calm. "I'm not criticizing," I said slowly. "I'm asking for basic consideration." "Basic consideration?" Derek's voice rose, sharp with mockery. "Like the basic consideration of not making your daughter's husband feel like a criminal in his own house?" His own house. There it was again. The casual assumption of ownership that crept into his tone, as if 6 months of freeloading had somehow transferred the deed into his name. His words landed heavy, not because they carried truth, but because of their audacity. His own house, he emphasized, as though repeated insistence could bend reality. And beneath it all, I could feel the slow, choking growth of that illusion, an invasive weed rooting itself deeper into the garden I had watered with sweat and sacrifice. "This isn't your house, Derek," I said quietly. "This is my house, and I'm asking you." "Damn it!" He slammed the mug down, the sharp crack of ceramic against granite echoing like a gunshot. Coffee splattered across the polished stone in dark, jagged streaks like blood spattered on a battlefield. "There it is," he sneered. "The truth finally comes out. Your house, your rules, and I should remember that I'm nothing more than a guest here, right?" My jaw tightened, muscles aching with the effort to hold back. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said," Derek shot back. "And you know what? I'm done pretending that this passive-aggressive nonsense is normal. You can't stand that Claire chose me. You can't stand that she has a life that doesn't revolve around you anymore." The accusations landed like hammer blows, not because they were true, but because they twisted everything I had sacrificed into something grotesque. I had welcomed him into this family, into this house. I had bitten my tongue for months while he treated my daughter like a personal assistant, contributing nothing while draining everything. "Dad." The voice cut through the room like a knife. The kitchen door creaked, and Claire stepped in a familiar silhouette I once trusted to see the truth. Her hair was tangled from sleep, her robe loosely cinched, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the scene like a judge entering a courtroom. Relief flickered in me, foolishly. At last, someone who would see through Derek's manipulation, someone who knew me well enough to recognize reality. "It seems your husband thinks asking for a coaster is an assault on his character," I said, forcing a thin smile. But Claire didn't look at me with understanding. She looked at Derek with concern, her brows knitting in that familiar way she always did when she thought someone was being treated unfairly. "What happened?" she asked, moving closer, her hand reaching instinctively for Derek's arm. The sight made my chest tighten. That protective gesture used to be reserved for me, now it was a wall built against me. Your father's at it again, Derek sighed, his voice heavy with false weariness, playing the part of the long-suffering victim. Can't even drink a cup of coffee without being lectured about respect and property damage. As if my sanity was unraveling simply because I asked someone to use a coaster. Claire's eyes turned toward me, and what I saw froze my blood. Not curiosity, not confusion, but disappointment, cold and final, as if the verdict had already been reached before I spoke. Dad, she said, patient in tone but sharp in edge, like she was correcting an unruly child. We've talked about this. You can't keep fighting over the small stuff. Small stuff. As if protecting my home, my rules, was petty. As if expecting the bare minimum of courtesy was an act of war. I wasn't picking a fight, I answered carefully. I asked him to use a coaster. That's not unreasonable. It's how you ask, Claire pressed, stepping between Derek and me like an official referee. Your tone, your attitude, you make him feel unwelcome. The irony was almost laughable, if it weren't so bitter. I was making him feel unwelcome in my own house, when he contributed nothing, respected nothing, and lived here as if it were his private hotel. Claire, you're misunderstanding. No, Dad, she snapped, her voice rising sharp and cutting, carrying a bitterness I'd been hearing more often. You can't accept that I'm married, that I've chosen someone, that my life isn't about making you happy anymore. The words dropped between us like a live grenade, the pin already pulled. I stared at her, this woman who once called me her hero, who once clung to my hand when storms scared her as a child. And now, she stood beside a man who gave her nothing, lashing out at the father who gave her everything. A part of me crumbled at that realization, but another part hardened, rising with a strange, unexpected strength. Isn't that right? Derek piled on, his voice now tinged with righteous injury that made me grind my teeth. Every day it's something new. How I load the dishwasher, where I park, how much time I spend job hunting. Nothing I do is ever good enough for the great man who built this house with his bare hands. He spat the last words like they were shameful, as though decades of hard labor and sacrifice were nothing but a boast. I never said that, I muttered, jaw locked. You didn't have to, Claire cut in, eyes flashing with fury out of all proportion to a fight over a coaster. It's in every look, every comment, every moment you make him feel he's not good enough for your precious daughter. I looked at her, my daughter, who once believed in me more than anyone, and saw only accusation, not defense of her husband from unfair treatment, but an attack on me for daring to live by my own boundaries. Then she folded her arms, her stance proud and defiant, the same gesture she used as a teenager when she thought she'd won. But now, it wasn't childish rebellion, it was a killing stroke. So, here's how it's going to be, Claire declared, her voice sharp as steel. You'd better start showing respect to my husband, or you'll be the one out on the street. The words landed like the final blow of a judge's gavel, cold, merciless, and absolute. I smiled. Not the shaky grin of a defeated father, but something else entirely. The corners of my mouth curled upward slowly, deliberately, not in resignation, but in quiet certainty. It was the smile of a man who had finally found the exit in a room long thought sealed. The kind of smile that made Claire falter, stepping back almost unconsciously, and that silenced Derek's video game sounds mid-battle, as if the device itself had lost power. Thank you, sweetheart, I said, my voice calm, so calm it startled even me. The words were granite steady, cutting through the charged air. You've made this easier than I ever imagined. The silence that followed was unlike any silence after a family argument. This wasn't the heavy, lingering aftermath of another domestic quarrel. No, this was the silence of air pressure shifting before a storm, when the birds vanish, animals freeze, and the sky holds its breath in unnatural colors. I could hear the ticking of the old clock in the living room with painful clarity, each second hammering against the stillness. Claire's face flickered from confusion to irritation, and then, for the first time, to a glimmer of unease. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharper now, betraying cracks in her confidence. I stepped to the counter, picked up Derek's mug still trailing a thin rivulet of coffee down its side, and wiped away the dripping stain with the corner of a towel. Then I placed it carefully in the dishwasher. The sharp clack of ceramic against steel rang out louder than expected, like a gavel striking wood, a punctuation mark closing months of swallowed tolerance. "That means," I said, closing the dishwasher door with measured precision, "you've just given me something I didn't know I needed." Derek finally looked up from his phone, the blue glow of the screen still haunting his eyes. The arrogance he had worn so easily earlier wavered, flickering like a candle under sudden wind. He blinked at me, uncertain as though I had become a stranger in the very kitchen he had claimed as his own stage. "What do you mean?" he muttered. I opened the cabinet above the coffee maker and drew out a small cardboard box I had kept tucked away for months, replacement filters for the expensive water system I had installed last year. A system that added $40 a month to my grocery bill. A luxury that made the coffee taste better. Made everything taste better, though no one ever noticed except me. "Allow me," I said evenly. One by one, I removed the filters, setting them down on the counter with deliberate care. Thud, thud, thud. Each sound precise, steady, like the measured beats of a drum announcing something inevitable. Claire and Derek watched, their expressions tightening as though each object laid out was not a filter, but evidence. Finally I looked up, meeting their eyes directly. "Permission," I said. Just one word. But it landed with the weight of iron, short, unadorned, yet heavy as a declaration. It was not a request, it was not a plea. It was the beginning of a new order, one in which the balance had shifted, and I no longer needed their approval. I bent down, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the plug. Such a simple gesture, yet when the cord slid from the socket with a muted click, the kitchen seemed to fall into an unnatural hush, as though a vein had been severed. The faint hum of the expensive Italian-made coffee machine died instantly, leaving a silence that pressed against the walls. "Dad, what are you doing?" Claire's voice rang out sharper than usual, but lacked the force to stop me. Her tone carried more surprise than authority, the question of someone witnessing something she couldn't quite interpret. I wrapped both hands around the machine. 7 kilograms of polished steel, a piece I had bought as a retirement indulgence, a little symbol of luxury after decades of restraint. It was heavy, solid, familiar, a reminder of mornings I had once savored. Now it sat in my arms not as a treasure, but as an artifact I no longer wished to carry. I lifted it, steady and unhurried, and walked toward the garage door. My steps were deliberate, the thud of my shoes echoing against the tile. "I've learned something about myself," I murmured as I set it gently down in the hallway, as if laying a relic to rest. From behind me came only silence. Derek had abandoned his phone mid-game, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a flicker of both confusion and unease in his gaze. He looked like a man watching a ritual whose rules he didn't understand, but whose outcome he instinctively feared. I returned to the counter. One by one, I gathered the other tokens of this long-fought battle, the spare water filters I had hoarded, the bag of overpriced organic beans I had hauled back from a small specialty shop downtown, the 12 ceramic coasters that I had asked Derek to use exactly 4 times in 6 months. I stacked them in my arms carefully, a quiet procession. Each clink of ceramic or rustle of packaging was its own announcement, like the sound of small doors closing. "You're overreacting," Claire said, her voice thinner now, almost tentative, as if she herself no longer believed the accusation. "No," I answered, shifting the weight of the bundle in my arms. "Throwing these things away would be dramatic. This is simply rearrangement." The beauty of the moment wasn't in what I was removing, it was in what I refused to explain. I could see them both trying to decode me, searching for the hidden threat, the apology, the angle, but there was none. Just absence, just subtraction. "What are you planning to do with all that?" Derek finally asked. And for the first time since he had moved in, his voice carried something that might have been genuine concern, or perhaps genuine curiosity. I paused at the threshold of the garage, arms full of items that had become symbols of daily skirmishes I was no longer willing to fight. Somewhere they'll be appreciated, I replied. Mrs. Collins mentioned her coffee machine broke last week. I imagine she'll put these to good use. Through the kitchen window, I caught sight of Mrs. Collins in her yard, trimming back the dead branches from her rose bushes. When she noticed me stepping across with the bundle, her head tilted in quiet surprise. Her eyes, bright under the brim of her gardening hat, held both curiosity and a flicker of gratitude. Perhaps she hadn't seen me smile in months, not like this. Behind me, Claire's voice trembled with a mixture of defiance and fear. What exactly is this supposed to prove? I didn't turn around. I adjusted the load in my arms, steadying it against my chest. That some problems solve themselves, I said evenly, once you stop giving them permission to exist. Mrs. Collins's expression, when I explained that I had a few spare coffee appliances I no longer needed, was worth every awkward breakfast I had endured, watching Derek ignore my entirely reasonable requests. Her gratitude came instantly pure, uncomplicated, and sincere. For the first time in months, I felt a small current of genuine appreciation. When I stepped back into the house 10 minutes later, the air inside the kitchen had thickened, dense enough to cut with a knife. Claire and Derek hadn't moved from where I had left them, frozen in place like two forgotten actors on a stage where the set had been quietly rearranged while they weren't paying attention. Their eyes shifted uneasily, scanning the room that now felt unfamiliar, stripped of its anchors. "All right then," Claire said at last, folding her arms. Her fingers tapped lightly against her elbow, a habit I remembered well from her teenage years, back when she always assumed that crossing her arms made her unshakable. It was her tell, the posture she adopted whenever she was gearing up to deliver an ultimatum. "You've made your point," she continued, her voice carrying a condescending patience, as though she were a teacher scolding a troublesome student. "Very dramatic, very effective, but can we get back to being adults now?" The word adult slipped from her mouth like a sentence passed down, transforming me into the immature party in my own home. I walked calmly to the sink, turned on the tap, and let the cold water rush across my hands. The metallic splash against steel echoed in the silence, mingling with the steady, deliberate rhythm of my heartbeat. I washed slowly, deliberately, as though I were scrubbing away months of accumulated indignity rather than a trace of soap. "So what exactly is that supposed to mean?" I asked, eyes fixed on their reflections in the window above the sink. "The whole performance," Derek cut in, his voice edged and low, lips pressed thin, his hands curled into fists on the countertop, but his eyes flickered away, unable to meet mine directly. His phone lay abandoned on the counter behind him, a silent testament that, for once, he was taking this conversation seriously. Claire stepped in quickly, her tone smoother, steadier, the practiced warmth of a professional trying to salvage a negotiation. "We get it. You're upset about respect." Message received. "The outburst is over. Now we can move forward." She even smiled, that dazzling, too-perfect smile she reserved for closing business deals. But I noticed the faint tremor at the corners of her lips, betraying the effort it took to keep the mask in place. Her words struck me like a blow. My dignity, reduced to nothing more than an emotional outburst. Months of exploitation recast as a family etiquette lesson. And in her mind, everyone was supposed to win in this version of events except, of course, for me, the man who had been threatened with homelessness in his own house. "So we're good then?" Derek asked cautiously, relief already beginning to color his voice. I saw the way his shoulders slackened, the tension draining as if he believed the storm had passed. "No more theatrics, right?" he added, as if defending one's home was nothing more than a bit of stage play. My jaw clenched on instinct, then I forced myself to release it. Control mattered more now than anything else. I dried my hands carefully, methodically, each motion precise, before turning back to face them. "That depends," I said evenly. The smile on Claire's face faltered, just slightly, the first crack in the glossy veneer of her confidence. "Depends on what?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharper, less certain. I let the silence stretch, steady and heavy, until I saw Derek swallow hard and Claire's posture stiffen. And in that pause, in that shift of balance, I realized they had finally seen it too, the first fracture in the ground beneath them. The confident glow on Claire's face flickered like a candle caught in a draft, and I saw her glance nervously at Derek. That look alone told me they hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. From the corner of my ear, the ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly grew louder, each second-hand snap sounding like a reminder that their borrowed time was running out. "No one threatened you, Dad," Claire insisted, her voice thinner now. "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "You told me I'd end up on the street if I didn't show proper respect to your husband." I watched as the words landed on her like a physical blow. I felt a chill slip down my spine, a pressure tightening across my chest, forcing my heartbeat into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Inside my own home, those were her exact words. Claire's face paled, then flushed bright red. Her hand twitched toward her purse on the counter, gripping it as though she needed something solid to hold on to, a lifeline in the rising storm. "That was just you acting helpless about everything," she stammered. "I'm disappointed. Disappointed." The words slithered out like a justification, a paper shield to excuse threatening her own father with homelessness. Something cold and sharp pressed deeper into my ribs. It wasn't rage. It was cleaner than that, sharper, steadier, more dangerous. "And what if I disappoint you again?" I asked evenly. Derek stepped forward, his jaw clenched, shoulders squared, trying to assert control with sheer physical presence. "Look, people say things they don't mean. You can't keep one comment hostage forever." Hostage. I let the irony hang in the air before twisting it. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. "Hostage? That's rich coming from someone who's turned my house into a free boarding lodge for 6 months. Derek's eyes flickered with recognition at his slip, and for the first time, he looked unsure. "I'm not holding anything hostage," I said, my voice hard as stone. "I'm asking what happens next time when you decide I haven't shown enough respect in my own home." "That won't happen again," Claire rushed to say, but I could hear the tremor of panic creeping into her voice. "We'll be more careful with our words," she added. Careful, not respectful, just careful enough not to be caught. The difference was everything. "Good," I said, a thin smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Not warm, not forgiving, just enough to make them both step back. "Because if either of you threatens to throw me out of my house again, you'll learn just how fast people can be shown the door." The silence that followed wasn't like the earlier awkward pauses. This was the silence of realization, the dawning awareness that the man they thought they could manage might not be manageable after all. I lifted my coffee mug, took a deliberate sip, then set it down with care, as though marking the end of a chapter. Everything had shifted. "You can't be serious," Derek muttered, but the certainty in his voice had vanished. "Try me," I replied, calm as granite. And in that calm, I felt a strange peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of finally standing on solid ground. Claire's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and what might have been fear before settling on outright fury. "So what now? You're threatening us? That's your solution?" "I don't make threats," I answered coldly. "I explain consequences. That's the difference." "This is insane," she snapped, her voice cracking, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. They clung there like glass beads, not entirely from regret, but more like the sting of a wound freshly touched. "You can't throw your daughter out over one argument," she shouted. "One argument?" I said softly, as though months of systematic disrespect can be boiled down to a single disagreement. "You're right," I went on, watching hope flash briefly in her eyes. "I can't throw my daughter out over one argument." Relief softened her face for half a heartbeat. "But I can remove 2 grown adults who thought they could threaten the man paying for this roof and then act shocked when he took them at their word." "We're family," Derek stammered, his voice breaking, the words spilling out like a prayer to a God who no longer answered. "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like iron on my tongue. "Is that what we call people who threaten to make you homeless in your own house?" Claire's cheeks burned crimson, her hands trembling now. "You're petty. You're cruel. You're not the father I knew." Her words cut deeper than I expected, not because they were true, but because they came from someone who once knew me better than anyone. Maybe not, I said softly, but this is the man I'm becoming, and if you don't like him, you're free to find somewhere else to live while I decide who I'll be next. I saw the exact moment the truth broke through. Their certainty collapsed like a slow-motion building implosion. Derek's bravado crumbled. Claire's fury thinned into desperation. "Fine," she spat, her voice shaking with either rage or panic. "If that's how you want to play this, then fine. But don't expect us to go quietly. Don't expect this to be easy." "I don't expect easy," I said calmly. "I expect final." I walked to the wall calendar, tapped my finger against the square, marking today's date. "You have 30 days. 30 days?" Derek's voice cracked like a teenager's, disbelief leaking into panic. His face blanched, hands fumbling toward his keys as if flight alone could undo reality. 30 days, I repeated, each syllable like a seal on a judgment. "Starting now." I turned away, steady, calm, feeling a strange weight lift. This wasn't revenge. It was a line drawn, a declaration that, at last, I was reclaiming my home and myself. The first thing I noticed upon waking was the smell of bacon, real bacon. It drifted down the hallway and soaked into the stairwell's wood grain, sweet and salty at once, stirring memories of long-lost mornings. But instead of warming me, it raised my guard, like a survivor catching the scent of gunpowder in a sealed room. Beneath it came the crackle of eggs in a pan and the soft choreography of drawers sliding, cabinets thudding, plates kissing the tabletop. When I descended the stairs in my robe, the kitchen presented itself like a stage set before curtain. Morning light leveled through the blinds, painting everything in a gentle gold. Too gentle, too arranged. Every prop perfectly placed, every gesture pre-blocked, the illusion of harmony directed to the inch. Claire stood at the stove like a performer hitting her marks, flipping bacon with practiced precision. Even her posture looked intentional, back straight, shoulders loose, but her fingers cinched a shade too tightly around the skillet handle, a tension she hoped the audience wouldn't see. Derek sat upright at the table, showered and dressed before noon for the first time in months. A newspaper, open real estate, not sports, I noticed, and he feigned small nods at paragraphs he likely wasn't reading. Under the table, his foot jittered, betraying the restlessness that the polite smile couldn't cover. "Morning, Dad," Claire sang, a brightness just a little too bright. "I made your favorite breakfast. Thought we could sit down together like we used to. Like we used to before they moved in and turned every meal into an audit of what had been taken and what would be taken next." I could smell more than bacon, the scent of a plan, heavy, buttery, and meant to slick the edges of yesterday until it slid out of sight. "Thoughtful," I said, settling into my usual chair, the one that had become the least comfortable seat in my own house. "Morning," Derek added, looking up from the listings with what might pass for sincerity. Claire was up early, wanted to do something special. Something special. After threatening to throw me out of my own home yesterday, breakfast now arrived with a smile. "Fresh coffee," Claire said, placing a cup before me with exaggerated care, as though setting down a timed device she hoped I'd diffuse properly. "The good kind. I went to that little shop downtown. You like the good kind. The expensive beans I'd stopped buying months ago when their presence doubled my grocery bills." She'd left early, spent money we both knew came from my account, to resurrect a ritual buried under the weight of their taking. I lifted a strip of bacon. It snapped perfectly between my teeth, crisp without a hint of burn. The eggs were over easy, yolks perfectly molten, the toast a steady, honeyed brown. She remembered every detail of my preferences, perhaps the first time in months she'd bothered to notice. The flavor was flawless, the feeling was not. A bitter question rose. Had my daughter only remembered me to convert memory into currency? "This is excellent," I said, and Claire's face brightened with what could have been genuine joy if it weren't so clearly choreographed. "I've been thinking," she said, easing into the chair with the smooth grace of someone stepping into a prepared speech. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Maybe we were all a little too emotional. A little too emotional. Language polished to a sheen, reducing a threat of eviction to a communication hiccup. "Were we?" I asked mildly, cutting into the egg, watching gold map itself across the plate. "I was," Derek offered, and to his credit, he tried for earnestness. "Been stressed about the job situation. I've taken it out on everyone. It wasn't fair to you." The job situation. 6 months of unemployment, relabeled to sound temporary and external like weather. "And I think," Claire continued, cadence smooth as if recited from a paperback on the discount therapy shelf, "we all need to be more intentional about communication so everyone feels heard and respected." Intentional communication, feeling heard, respect. Words wrapped like gift paper around something hollow. Gloss over rot and call it lacquer. I ate slowly, not for pleasure, but to extend the scene, to watch how far they'd push the performance. The sidelong glances, the measured smiles, the lines they'd rehearsed in some whispered strategy session. Bacon perfect. Coffee exactly my blend. Every sensory note tuned to summon nostalgia and bargain with it. "This is nice," I said at last, setting my fork down softly, a sound small enough to be taken for surrender. "Very thoughtful." Claire's face lit immediately, the way an actor brightens at applause after the big finish. "So we're good," she breathed. "We can put yesterday behind us." "Oh, we can certainly leave yesterday behind," I said, rising from my chair and collecting the plates. The porcelain clinked faintly, each sound like the toll of a small bell announcing judgment. Their eyes followed every movement, as if even the simple act of rinsing dishes carried a hidden verdict. "At least once we talk about what happens today." A spark of hope flickered across their faces, brief and fragile. "What do you mean?" Claire asked. I carried the plates to the sink, sliding them under the stream of cold water. The habit was mine alone cleaning, even when their dirty dishes piled around me like physical evidence of their occupation. "I mean," I said, scrubbing and drying with methodical care, "the breakfast was excellent, but it doesn't change the truth. You still have 29 days. The words fell into the kitchen with the precision of a gavel. The silence that followed was not the gasp of yesterday's shock. It was the silence of a courtroom after a sentence is pronounced. No one dared move, no one dared breathe too loudly. "Thomas, you can't be serious," Derek said, his voice unsteady though his hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened, clinging to the wood, as if the table itself might collapse with the rest of his illusions. "I'm not trying to put you out," I replied, folding the dish towel with deliberate exactness before hanging it neatly on its hook. "I'm asking you to honor your own words. You told me I'd be on the street if I didn't show proper respect. I've simply accepted your terms and redirected them where they belong." "That's not what we meant," Claire blurted, her voice breaking into urgency. "Isn't it?" I turned, facing them squarely. For once, both stayed silent. "You made breakfast," I continued. "Yes," Claire said quickly, her eyes glistening as though a few strips of bacon and perfectly fried eggs might erase the humiliation of yesterday. Naive optimism, or blind arrogance, perhaps both. "It was delicious," I said evenly. "Thank you. 29 days. I left them at the table, surrounded by the remnants of their attempted reconciliation, and went upstairs. From behind the paper-thin walls I caught fragments of their urgent whispers, voices sharp with panic, chairs scraping against the floor, a hand slamming down for emphasis. It sounded like two conspirators discovering their carefully plotted scheme had sprung a fatal leak. By the time I showered, dressed, and came back down, they were gone. The kitchen gleamed, scrubbed to a spotless shine, every surface gleaming with a guilty kind of perfection. The bacon grease had been erased, the dishes all put away as though they believed immaculate counters could conceal the truth of what had passed here. But on the countertop, where I once made coffee each morning, lay a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Claire's, meticulous and deliberate. "Dad, we'll be staying at Derek's sister's for a few days. We need time to think about what you really want from us. This isn't over." The signature at the bottom was brief, a single C. Not the warmth of your daughter, not even Claire, but a clipped mark, sharp as a blade. It was less a farewell than a warning, a promise etched in ink that the battle was far from finished. I stared at the phone for a long while before dialing Mrs. Collins's number. My finger hovered above the screen, trembling slightly, as though this call wasn't just about scheduling an appraisal but about severing the last cord binding me to the past. "Yes, Mrs. Collins. I'd like to set up the property appraisal we discussed. When could someone come by?" The appraiser arrived Tuesday morning, a brisk woman in low heels carrying a clipboard and moving through the house with a practiced eye. She circled the rooms quickly but thoroughly, jotting notes with the precision that reminded me of my years as an engineer, where every small detail spoke volumes about true value. She tapped lightly on the crown molding I had installed myself, ran her palm across the hardwood floors I had sanded and finished late into the night, and nodded with something close to admiration. "These are in remarkably good condition," she said, her tone clinical but impressed. "It should sell quickly in this market." When she read out preliminary numbers, I felt sweat bead across my palms, not from fear, but from something stranger, relief. For the first time in decades, I could see with absolute clarity that the quiet sacrifices of 40 years, missed vacations, overtime shifts, careful budgets had solidified into something undeniable, a number that reflected the worth of every choice I had made. I was still processing that revelation when the sound came, a low rumble that tightened my gut before my mind could name it. The guttural growl of Derek's old pickup engine drifted in through the window, familiar and unwelcome, a sound I had learned to dread after months of hearing it in my driveway. I froze in the kitchen, pulse quickening. It was the sensation of a prisoner hearing the clink of keys turning in the cell door. I moved to the window in time to see the truck shudder to a stop. The driver's door opened, and Claire climbed out first, her movements sharp, urgent. Not the body language of reconciliation, but of someone bracing for confrontation. Derek followed, his posture stiff, shoulders squared as if already preparing for battle. And then the passenger door opened. Out stepped Marilyn. For a moment the yard seemed to hold its breath. Her hair, once long and flowing, was cut neatly now, styled into something professional and deliberate. Light makeup accentuated sharp features, and her thin smile was not one of warmth but of calculation. She looked less like an estranged ex-wife paying a casual visit, and more like a strategist stepping onto a chessboard mid-game. Her eyes met mine across the driveway. They weren't warm, nor openly hostile, but calm, eerily calm. It was the kind of composure that told me immediately she hadn't come of her own volition. She had been enlisted, positioned, perhaps even rehearsed. Inside my chest, a tangle of emotions flared. 20 years of shared history rose like ghosts, memories of laughter at kitchen tables, arguments over bills, the long decline of a marriage that once felt unbreakable. Alongside it came the bitterness of betrayal, the ache of endings, and finally, the cold alertness of a man who realizes a new piece has just been placed on the board. Marilyn's arrival wasn't chance, it was strategy, and the game had just shifted. "Hello, Thomas." Marilyn's voice carried the same manufactured warmth I remembered all too well. Her tone didn't falter, but her eyes flicked toward me in a quick, involuntary glance, testing, measuring, gauging. That tiny gesture was enough to betray that the warmth wasn't spontaneous at all. It was strategy. "You look well." Well, after 8 years of divorce and nearly 2 years of near silence, that was her opening move. Not an acknowledgement of the circumstances that had drawn her here. Not an explanation for why she stood on my property now. Just a polite salutation dressed up as normalcy, designed to reset the board in her favor. "Marilyn," I answered evenly, "this is unexpected." She stepped closer to the porch. The sharp clack of her designer heels echoed against the concrete walkway, the very walkway I had mixed, poured, and finished with my own hands. Each step resounded like a deliberate intrusion onto territory I had built. "Claire called me yesterday," she said, tone deliberately gentle. "She's worried about you." "Worried?" I repeated. "About what exactly?" "The situation," Marilyn replied, and the word sent a chill through me. Situation. The same word Derek had used to dress up his unemployment. The same word now being stretched over the ugliness of threatening to evict me from my own home. as though reducing it to a temporary situation might erase the truth of it. She carried on with the careful cadence of someone rehearsed. Claire told me you've been struggling emotionally since retirement, that you've been making wild accusations, threatening to put them out over trivial disagreements. Each phrase, struggling emotionally, wild accusations, trivial disagreements, dropped from her lips with mechanical precision, like lines read from a script, not hers, Claire's. I wasn't hearing my ex-wife. I was hearing my daughter's story, recycled through a surrogate voice of authority, meant to overwrite my version of reality. I stayed silent, letting the echo of her words linger. Marilyn took another step, closing the space between us until barely a stride remained. The move was familiar. She had once used this same physical nearness during our marriage, a kind of practiced intimacy meant to conceal leverage with tenderness. Old ghosts flickered moments where I had mistaken proximity for partnership. "I know you," she said softly. "You're not the kind of man who would put his family on the street. You're not cruel." Ah, so my current stance was merely a lapse, a deviation from the real Thomas, something to be corrected with the right intervention. "You're absolutely right," I said, and I saw a spark of hope flash across her polished expression. "I'm not cruel, which is why I gave them 30 days instead of the 24 hours they actually earned." Her face faltered, the flawless mask slipping for the briefest instant. A longer blink than normal, a twitch at the corner of her mouth. Proof enough that Claire had left out some crucial details when spinning her story. "Did Claire mention," I continued, "that she threatened to throw me out of my own home if I didn't show proper respect to Derek? Did she tell you that?" Marilyn hesitated. "I'm sure there's more to it than—" "There is," I cut in. "Plenty more." I laid it out. The credit card statements, the utility bills, the grocery receipts. 6 months of expenses shouldered by me alone. Thousands siphoned off while Derek, unemployed for half a year, somehow managed to buy game credits and dine out. Each fact I dropped landed like a stone breaking the surface of still water. And with each one, Marilyn's poise wavered. Her blinks slowed, her breath caught, her carefully constructed neutrality frayed at the edges. "Claire told me they were helping with costs," she whispered at last, her voice stripped of its earlier authority, no longer commanding, only uncertain. "Claire says many things," I replied. "Very few of them are true." I let silence stretch, then deliberate, heavy, undeniable. The kind of silence that forces a person to hear themselves, to reckon with the echo of their own misplaced trust. This time, I wasn't going to let anyone else narrate my story. Not my daughter, not Derek, and not the ex-wife standing on the porch. The version of events they had built was collapsing, and I would make damn sure the truth had room to breathe. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of victory or reconciliation. It was the silence of someone realizing they had been recruited into a mission built on faulty intelligence. Marilyn's eyes fluttered rapidly, like she had just swallowed an ice cube whole. It wasn't the silence of the triumphant, it was the stunned quiet of someone suddenly aware they had been a pawn on someone else's chessboard. Her gaze darted toward the pickup truck. Behind the glass, Claire was waving her hands frantically, her wide eyes filled with panic. She looked less like a daughter calmly observing than a director in disarray, watching her actor forget lines in the middle of a live performance. Derek sat stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched, his hand cutting through the air in frustrated gestures that resembled a coach berating a team at halftime. "Maybe I should talk to her," Marilyn said carefully, her voice subdued now, stripped of the earlier composure. "Maybe you should," I agreed, my tone measured. "And while you're at it, ask her why she thought dragging her estranged mother, someone who once systematically benefited from my sacrifices, back into the middle of this was a good idea." Marilyn flushed crimson. Her hand tightened involuntarily on the strap of her handbag, the faint tremor betraying more than her words ever could. "I wasn't orchestrating anything," she muttered, though even she seemed unconvinced by the denial. "When was the last time you called Claire before yesterday?" I pressed. "The last birthday card? Christmas gift? Any sign you remembered she existed at all?" Her face froze. Another fracture in the polished mask. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her chest rising with a sharp inhale, but there was no answer. The truth was written in the blank space she left hanging months, maybe years of absence. Claire hadn't turned to her mother for comfort. She had conscripted her as backup, a new ally only after exhausting every local resource. "I think I should go," Marilyn whispered at last. The words carried no confidence now, only resignation. "I think that's best," I replied. She turned back toward the truck. Through the windshield, Claire's mouth moved in frantic bursts, Derek's hands slicing through the air in visible frustration. Their silent argument played out like a pantomime, blame, defense, strategy all collapsing into futility. Yet neither of them climbed out to rescue her. They just stayed there, tethered to their unraveling plan, until finally the engine roared to life. The truck pulled away, the sound of the engine fading down the street, leaving behind only a dense quiet on my porch. I stood there, the air cool against my face, with a strange mixture in my chest: vindication, yes, but also something heavier. Because victories like this didn't come with joy. They came with the bitter confirmation that what I called family had split into opposing sides of a battlefield, and I was standing alone, holding the truth like a weapon no one else wanted to touch. When I opened the door, the sight that greeted me looked less like a visit from neighbors and more like an outdoor tribunal. They stood in a loose line across my porch, faces a mixture of pity and determination, the kind of expressions jurors might wear after hearing only one side of a case and being marched out to deliver a verdict. At the rear of the group stood Claire, silent, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her lips curled into the faintest smirk, a look that told me she believed she had finally drawn her trump card. She wouldn't meet my eyes, but her shoulders were squared, her chin tilted upward, the posture of someone convinced she had shifted the balance of power. Derek loomed beside her, watchful but deferential, the accomplice standing guard while the true strategist let others do the speaking. Mrs. Collins stepped forward first. Her voice still carried the gentle warmth I had known for decades, but her eyes were hard, unyielding, like river stones. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said. It was the tone of a friend convinced she was performing an act of mercy, unaware she was being wielded as a weapon. Mark Rivera followed, shifting uneasily from foot to foot, scratching the back of his neck as though he wished to be anywhere else. "It's about what's been going on with your family," he muttered, his words halting. "Claire came by yesterday. She was worried about you." His gaze stayed locked on the ground, but his willingness to repeat the script even awkwardly lent the accusations a gravity they didn't deserve. And then Mr. Harris, the man who had once steadied a ladder while I hammered shingles into his roof, spoke with a strange, rehearsed certainty. "She showed us some concerning behaviors," he said, his weathered hands turning his knit cap over and over, betraying his discomfort. "Giving away expensive equipment without reason. Sudden mood changes. Signs of cognitive decline." He spoke the phrase like a diagnosis lifted straight from a medical chart, even as his hands trembled with unease. Each word fell like pebbles, small on their own, but together they formed a boulder pressing down on my chest. Acts of kindness sharing what I no longer needed, redistributing what they never valued, were now twisted into evidence of instability. I looked at the faces of neighbors I had known for years and felt, just for a moment, like a stranger standing trial on my own porch. Behind them, Claire's smirk lingered. She had weaponized not just her voice, but the entire community I had once considered mine. And I understood, with a cold clarity, that this was not a visit. It was a campaign, a carefully orchestrated attempt to strip away not only my authority, but my sanity itself. "You've all been very thorough," I said, tone as neighborly as I could manage. "We only want to help," Mrs. Collins replied, her voice soft but firm. "Perhaps we could all sit down, work out an arrangement that makes everyone comfortable." An arrangement, mediated by my neighbors. A compromise meant to disguise pressure, to force me into continued exploitation under the banner of family harmony. "Before we do that," I said evenly, "would you like to see something?" I stepped into my study and returned with a heavy stack of manila folders, weeks in the making, Bank statements, credit card bills, utility receipts. 6 months of evidence organized, tabbed, and undeniable. The folders slapped against the table with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the quiet kitchen like a judge's gavel. "This," I said, sliding the first bundle toward Mrs. Collins, "is what Claire calls baseless accusations." The pages whispered as she opened them. Her eyes flickered across the numbers, her brows knitting tighter with each line. Mark Rivera leaned in close, his face darkening as he checked the columns, as though needing to confirm he wasn't misreading the figures. Mr. Harris, calloused hands trembling slightly, held a credit card statement that showed $1,247 spent on restaurants in a single month. They spent that much on dining, I confirmed, while not contributing a dime to household expenses. 6 months, $15,000, all mine, not including rent, not including utilities. I let the silence linger, let them sit with the arithmetic of exploitation. The recognition began to dawn on their faces, the same recognition I had reached months earlier, that generosity and parasitism are not the same thing. "But Claire said they were helping with costs," Mrs. Collins murmured weakly. "Did she say they were contributing money?" I asked. "Or did she let you assume that, while she drained my accounts?" The silence that followed was no longer one of certainty. It was the silence of people realizing they had been manipulated into defending something they did not truly understand. "There's more," I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Would you like to hear her threaten to throw me out of my own house if I didn't respect her unemployed husband?" I pressed play. Claire's voice, clear, cold, unmistakable, filled the room. Her words rang out like smoke and fire hanging in the air. "You'll be out on the street if you don't do what I say." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Collins's face went pale. Mark Rivera exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Mr. Harris turned his cap in his hands, his discomfort impossible to hide. "She threatened me in my own kitchen," I said quietly, "all because I asked her husband to use a coaster." The neighbors turned toward Claire, but they no longer saw a dutiful daughter, worried for her father's well-being. They saw a manipulator who had lied, who had recruited them as unwilling accomplices in her deception. "I think we should go," Mark Rivera said at last, his voice low but firm. "I think that's best," I agreed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their silence, and the new way their eyes regarded Claire, was the verdict. And it was final. The footsteps receded one by one, leaving behind an unnatural hollowness on the porch. The faint trace of Mrs. Collins's perfume lingered in the hot summer air, mixing with the smell of sun-baked asphalt. Mr. Harris kept his eyes to the ground, his cap heavy in his hands, as though it weighed more than it ever had. Mark Rivera turned once more before leaving, his gaze sharp, cutting through Claire's carefully woven mask of victimhood. And then, it was just the three of us. The porch, once crowded and buzzing with judgment, now felt like an abandoned grandstand after the crowd had dispersed. No more allies, no more witnesses, just 3 figures left to face each other in the rawest of silence. "You've turned them against us," Claire's voice cracked, her hands clutched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The anger in her tone was braided with something she had never shown before: fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being left with no shield to hide behind. "No," I said quietly. "I only told them the truth. You turned them against yourselves." Derek spoke next, and for the first time since I'd known him, his tone carried no arrogance, no demand, no performance of authority, only a fragile human weakness. "We don't have anywhere else to go," he muttered, the words falling heavy onto the porch like small stones that nonetheless landed with weight. I leaned against the doorframe, the light spilling out behind me, marking the line between inside and out, between my sanctuary and their intrusion. My voice was calm, steady. "I'm still right where I was before you moved in. It's you who no longer has a place." "Wherever that is, Dad, please," Claire whispered, her words suddenly stripped of all the barbs, all the clever manipulations. In that moment, she was less the strategist who had turned neighbors into pawns, and more a lost child realizing the limits of her power. But the plea no longer reached me. I pressed the door slowly. the hinges groaning in protest as if aware of the finality in the act. Through the narrowing gap, I caught one last glimpse of them, two figures huddled together, their whispers frantic, their desperation bleeding into the night air. And then, the door clicked shut. The silence that followed fell heavy, like a theater curtain closing after the last scene. For the first time in years, the house was mine again. Through the window, I watched the truck's taillights fade as it turned down the corner, swallowed by the dark. The front yard, which had moments before been filled with tension and footsteps, was now silent, nothing but the whisper of wind weaving through the maples I had planted decades ago. I stood there, hand resting on the curtain, feeling as though I had just witnessed the final act of a play that had dragged on far too long. Later that night, I sat down in my old wooden chair, the one that had molded to my shape over the years. My thumb absently traced the grooves of a weathered ring as I dialed my brother's number. "David," I said when he answered, my voice steadier than I expected. "Is the guest house still open? I think I'm ready for that new chapter." His laughter came warm and immediate, rolling through the line like a rope pulling me back from the edge. "I've been waiting for this call for months," he said, his tone both reassuring and certain. "When can you get here?" "As soon as I can sell the house," I replied, my eyes sweeping across the room that had borne witness to decades of joy, betrayal, and silence heavy enough to choke on. Selling it wasn't just a real estate transaction, it was surrendering the ghosts that had made their home in these walls. It was finally allowing myself to release what should have been let go long ago. The next morning, dew clung to the windshield of my car. Tucked beneath the wiper blade was a business card, one corner damp and curling. I pulled it free and turned it over. Scrawled across the back in Claire's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "Call us. We can work this out." I held the card between my fingers for a long moment, long enough to imagine her face as she wrote it, the careful loops of her pen carrying both defiance and desperation, and then I tore it into shreds. The pieces caught the morning breeze and scattered across the lawn I had mowed and tended for 40 years. They fluttered like startled birds, settling into the grass where memories of summer barbecues and autumn leaves once lived. It was a ritual, a farewell, a final letting go. Some relationships are like dead branches. Every attempt to bind them back only makes them splinter more. They are not meant to be grafted onto the tree of your life again. They are meant to be laid down, buried, and left behind. And this time, I knew with absolute certainty, I was ready for what came next. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And when you're ready for the next chapter, just click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.